heard three testimonies from people who had suffered from emotional trauma and overcome it. Now, one of them was called Jimmy, one was called Lisa, and the third was called Victor. But they should all have been called Victor, because all of them reported a victory, not victimhood, but a victory over victimhood. They aroused my emotions, and I'm sure they did yours also, and they schooled my emotions. But I wanted to say something about that now, because I want to change the register. I have to change the register. I don't have such a tale to report as they had. Instead, I hope to arouse your intellectual faculties and perhaps to challenge them. But I just give you a heads up that I'm not in the league of those people who we heard yesterday. I couldn't possibly tell such a moving tale. So my topic is literature, philosophy, and the Christian conception of suffering. Tragedy and comedy are the fundamental forms of dramatic literature. That's why they're so easy to understand. In a tragedy, someone who has everything ends badly. In a comedy, everyone comes out okay. Simple stuff, but strangely deep and instructive. After performing a sacred rite of self-intoxication in the temple at Delphi, the stoned princess oracle of Apollo babbled to Laius, king of Thebes, that his infant son would someday kill his father and marry his mother, Jocasta, Laius's wife. This prophecy began a famous chain of events, an ancient tragedy. Laius believed what he heard the priestess say, and thereby showed his piety. He had faith. People today who consider themselves tough-minded and clear-headed discourage such faith. They tell us to believe nothing we have not first understood. But men and women of faith know better. When a God speaks, we must believe. Understanding divine words may be the work of a lifetime or longer, but the words of a God must be true. The vast temple complex at Delphi, which incidentally was the greatest tourist attraction of the ancient world, dozens of hotels. That vast complex was a monument to the god of wisdom, Apollo, whose priestesses could answer any question. Laius asked what the future held for him and was told that his son would murder him and marry his mother. Laius believed the oracle, but he could not accept it. That's not surprising, you'll say, but isn't it? How can you believe that Apollo told the truth about the future and yet still hope to change it? That's irrational. But still not surprising in emotional terms, you will reply. The role assigned to Laius was a tragic one. No one willingly plays a tragic part in the drama of his life. Tragedy tells of the disturbing fragility of human existence. Circumstances make someone attractive, powerful, and seemingly untouchable, the kind of person we would all probably like to be. Excuse me. And then he's crushed in the fullness of his power, hurled down from his high station, ground to dust, and scattered to forgetful winds. That is the mechanism of tragedy. Fear and pity grip the onlookers. Desperation taught Laius to see, or think he saw, an opening in the doom that had not yet closed around him. If his son were to die, the tragic sequence of events foretold by the oracle could never begin. There appeared to be room for maneuver. But even desperate fathers do not easily murder their sons. Instead, Laius ordered one of his servants to do the deed. Not an easy thing, of course, even for them. The servant almost did it. He conveyed the child to a rugged mountainside, wounded its feet, and left it exposed to the elements, confident that nature would finish the job, but in such a way that he, the servant, would not have caused, not directly caused, the child's death. He reported to the king, however, that the orders had been carried out. The servant was unaware that he was working against fate. The infant did not die, but was rescued by a stranger, and in the end adopted by the childless King Polybus, king of Corinth, who kept the boy's origin a secret and raised him as his son and heir. Because of his wounded feet, he was called, you probably know who, Oedipus. Eidos means wounded. Podos is the Greek for foot. When Oedipus, the Corinthian prince, came of age, he too consulted the oracle at Delphi, just as his biological father Laius had done. And the word of Apollo to Oedipus was that he would murder his father and marry his mother if he ever returned home. Like Laius, Oedipus believed what the oracle spoke. Like Laius, he took steps to avoid what the oracle foretold. However, the evasive action of Oedipus, unlike that of Laius, was reasonable. The fate pronounced against Oedipus came with a tantalizing, seemingly saving condition. The unthinkable would happen if Oedipus ever returned home. Oedipus's fault was not the same as his father's futile attempt to resist fate. It was not disrespectful to the god. His only shortcoming was ignorance. He thought he knew what the oracle meant by home, but in that he was mistaken. He forsook Corinth, where he had been raised as a prince, and fled to Thebes, believing Thebes to be neutral territory. And so he fled towards, instead of away from, the oracle's fulfillment. On the way to Thebes, Oedipus fought and killed a troublesome stranger. You may be able to guess who he was. The father, Laius, he had never known. Next, he met and defeated the Sphinx, a monstrous creature, half woman and half lion, who lay in wait before the gates of Thebes, devouring all who could not answer her riddle. Oedipus, by answering, conquered her and entered Thebes as a young hero, fit to marry King Laius' recently widowed queen, Jocasta. Years would pass before these events of Oedipus's life, so colorfully lived and so little understood, would resolve themselves into the riddle they were and reveal Oedipus to himself as the murderer of his father and the incestuous lover of his mother. If only Oedipus had not been pious, you might think. he would not have believed the oracle and might have escaped from his tragic fate. But impiety is itself an evil, and it would only have ushered the same fate in through another door. Your fate, if you have one, is an outcome that awaits you behind every door. Oedipus's real mistake lay not in his piety, but in his self-assurance, his confidence in having understood what the oracle meant. Divine words are always true, but rarely mean what our limited minds and deceitful hearts understand. Oedipus did not escape his fate. Instead, he enacted one of the bitterest tragedies in the literary canon. He taught us how insignificant are kings and sons of kings, and all the more so our common selves. How pitiless is destiny, how absurd is human life. Oedipus failed to understand his human limitations. However, human limitations are something the philosopher Socrates understood very well. That's why when the oracle at Delphi named him the wisest man in Athens, Socrates believed, but without any claim to understanding. By believing, he showed his piety, just as Laius and Oedipus had. But unlike them, he did not think he knew what the oracle meant, and therefore did not assume that it portended any evil. Instead, he embraced the oracle as his fate and devoted the rest of his life to investigating it. His ignorance proved to be the threshold of wisdom. Before the oracle had spoken any word about him, Socrates had reached on his own the painful conclusion that he had no wisdom. He lacked knowledge of the one thing needful. He could not answer with certainty the fundamental question of how we ought to live. Other adults seemed to have no difficulty doing so. You had only to observe how confidently they lived, assured of certain certainties, seizing their opportunities, playing to their strengths, trying every angle, jumping at the main chance. Socrates, by contrast, followed a path of hesitation and humility. And it led him to confess his ignorance. Now it turned out that ignorance and humility were exactly what was needed for a life of inquiry, the life to which the oracle had summoned Socrates. Until further notice, he must question people with a reputation for wisdom and never stop until he found one who was wise. Then, in company with this wise man, Socrates can approach the oracle at Delphi and say to Apollo, "You told me that I was the wisest man in Athens. Yet here I stand before you today with this Athenian, this great Athenian, who is truly wise. And now I beg you, O Apollo, help me serve you more effectively by telling me in what sense I am wiser than he." If you know anything about the life of Socrates, you will know that he questioned many Athenian citizens, both great ones and insignificant ones, and a good number of Greeks from other cities as well, but never found one who was wiser than himself, or even as wise. And that's how he learned the meaning of the oracle. Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, not because he possessed any affirmable wisdom, but because he alone was aware of his ignorance. Other men were as ignorant as Socrates, but they believed themselves to be wise, and therein lay their folly. Ignorant as he was, Socrates was a better man than Laius and Oedipus. Not only did Socrates believe the oracle, but in simplicity he accepted the fate it laid upon him, for it was a fate. It obliged him to forsake his work as stonemason and sculptor, to neglect his family, to incur the wrath of Athens, suffer a humiliating trial, be found guilty on fraudulent charges, and condemned to death. It led to his execution. Socrates, then, was a tragic figure, like Laius and Oedipus, you may be about to conclude. Even more tragic, perhaps, because he was a better man. But don't be too hasty. The tragic reading of Socrates' life is just what Plato, the main source of our knowledge about Socrates, is at pains to prevent. It is all wrong, Plato says, to think of Socrates as a tragic figure. In the first place, we're wrong about death. It is our unthinking fear of death that makes it the great weapon of tragedy. The difficulty is not so much to escape death, Socrates tells the jury at his trial. The difficulty, the real one, is to escape from doing wrong, which is far more fleet of foot. In this present instance, Socrates continues, I, the old man, have been overtaken by the slower of the two, by death. But my accusers, who are clever and quick, have been overtaken by the faster, by iniquity. Though Socrates is condemned to death, and his lying accusers will continue to live, he believes himself to be in the better position. No doubt this death sentence pronounced by the jury was bound to come, he says. But I think the result is fair enough. Well, how can it be fair, you'll wonder, when a man is wrongfully condemned to death? But Socrates answers his question in his parting words to the jury. You too, gentlemen of the jury, Socrates tells them, you too must look forward to death with confidence and fix your minds on this one belief, which is certain, that a good man is not harmed, either in life or in death, and his affairs are not neglected by the gods. Do right, Socrates, in effect, tells the jurors, and view the approach of death with confidence. Socrates refuses to be seen as a tragic figure because he has believed the God and served the God and embraced the fate the God put upon him, and then been justly treated in the end. However much it may seem otherwise to those who fear death too much, or do evil too willingly, or understand too little the ways of the gods. The piety of Laius and Oedipus was insufficient because it consisted only of faith. The piety of Socrates is greater because it adds to faith the virtue of submission to the divine will. Laius rebelled against his fate and perished. Oedipus blundered into his fate and also perished. In literary terms, that makes them tragic figures. But Socrates embraced his fate and discovered, through a lifetime of inquiry, that the affairs of those who do so are not neglected by the gods. He lived his earthly life in a way that fit him for a better one, as he says, in the islands of the blessed. In literary terms, the life of Socrates was a comic one. Comedy isn't what makes you laugh, necessarily, nor tragedy what makes you cry. Neoplatonists of the early Middle Ages reflected further on the mysteries of tragedy, comedy, and fate. At the beginning of the Consolation of Philosophy, we meet Boethius. His dates, in case they're not immediately present to your mind, 477 to 524 AD. So at the beginning of his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy, we meet Boethius, the character, the author of that work also, and the main character of its autobiographical, philosophical, allegorical tale. The historical Boethius, the author of the book, wrote The Consolation during the last year of his life, while he waited for an executioner to inflict on him the brutal death to which he had been sentenced. If you like the details of such things, you can ask it in the Q&A period when that comes. Boethius had fallen from the pinnacle of power, wealth, and influence he enjoyed as first minister of the Roman Empire, of the Western Empire, and now was sentenced to a hideous death for a crime he probably did not commit, almost certainly did not commit. We're not surprised to find him distraught and resentful at the beginning of this remarkable literary masterpiece. But in Boethius' story, Dame Philosophy appears to him in a vision and promises to cure him of all his ills. What ails him, however, according to her, is not his situation, but his reaction to it, the distress and resentment he is allowed to get the upper hand. And what will cure him is not a return to the status, wealth, and power he once enjoyed, but an improvement of his vision. Boethius must take upon him the mystery of things. The God who created human history is not the author of fate, and therefore not of tragedy either, as some ancient philosophers mistakenly believed. Something like fate exists, it is true, but this fundamental shaper of things should not be confused with fate. As Dame Philosophy describes it, it more closely resembles what Germans call Verhängnisse, if there's any Germans here, the unbreakable linkage of cause with effect, the all-encompassing web of events in which our lives lie captive. It's not impossible for these Verhängnisse to entangle our hopes and make the life we wish for unachievable, or the life we have unsustainable, just as has happened to Boethius. But Dame Philosophy shows Boethius that this unbreakable web in which mortals are so easily entangled is not the fateful, treacherous thing he takes it to be. It is nothing other than creation, God's creation, chosen because it is good. Moreover, it leads to a destination that we ourselves would have chosen if we had God's infinite capacity to understand and his unblemished goodness to guide our choosing. Boethius' life is therefore only tragic in appearance. In reality, it is a comic one. There were logical problems in Dame Philosophy's answer to the question of fate, and in her Christian repackaging of Socrates' comic conception of life. Those problems would be discussed and deepened over the centuries, and finally resolved, in my opinion, by G.W. Leibniz in his Theodicy, which I've been told is on sale at the book stand. This Theodicy appeared in 1710, was the hit of the 18th century in theology. But what is more significant for present purposes is the advance Boethius makes in understanding the human condition, an advance beyond what we can learn from the lives of Oedipus and Laius and even Socrates. Socrates went beyond Oedipus and the tragic poets in showing how a wise man could accept his fate and entrust himself to the benevolent care of the gods. Boethius clarified the nature of their care. If the God we trust is a providential king, rather than a tyrannical assigner of fates, then we can reject our fate, as Oedipus and Laius tried to do, because we can reject the notion of fate itself. What the ancients knew as fate was just the causal web by which all events are determined, and whose determination can sometimes be painful to us. But the ancients did not know that the creator and sustainer of the causal web chose it not indifferently, nor in acquiescence to evil, or as an impediment to human freedom, but as a full concession to our freedom, allowing for all the inevitable mistakes and sins, follies and crimes, not only to be committed and suffered in all their pathetic consequences, but also to be expiated and, at last, redeemed. Human struggle is not made absurd by fate. It is redeemed by providence. Human freedom, with all the folly and evil it brings to life, can be housed within a structure that turns every evil purpose to good and every misfortune and folly to redemptive suffering. What Joseph says to his brothers in Egypt can be said of the whole sad pageantry of fallen humanity. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Oedipus rejected too little, and Socrates accepted too much. Only the surface of life is tragic. Life's secret is comedy. To my knowledge, Leibniz is the last major philosopher to take up these questions in the terms in which Boethius left them. But he did no more than free Boethius' account from logical difficulties raised against it by the Renaissance thinker. Lorenzo Valla was his name. That done, Leibniz thought he could enroll Boethius as an early partisan of his own famous doctrine, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Had a great deal of mockery attached to it, that doctrine, but nevertheless, that was the one that Leibniz produced. All things in the universe conspire to achieve the good, and any right-thinking person will therefore improve his own circumstances to the best of his ability, but also acquiesce in whatever comes of his honest efforts. With Leibniz, we arrive at the end of one long thread from the history of thought, which I wanted to hold up for your consideration. It begins with the tragedy of Oedipus the king and runs through the lives and thoughts of Socrates, Boethius, and Valla, to end in Leibniz. Oedipus and the whole tragic drama for which his story is emblematic pose a problem for philosophy and for everyone who takes life seriously. They present evidence for the irrationality, futility, and forsakenness of human existence. They make it appear that unmerited suffering can destroy even what is best and can only be avoided by luck. They show us fictional worlds in which human life is tragic, and they summon us to wonder whether our world is any different. However, from Socrates to Leibniz, with ever-increasing conviction and depth, mainstream Western philosophy, like the Christian religion, has always affirmed the contrary. Life is not a tragedy, but a comedy. God, who caters providently for the sparrow, has provided at least as well for each of us. After Leibniz, with the Enlightenment, darker fancies about human life returned to Western thought, eventually giving birth to our own secular, materialistic, naturalistic thinking, upon which the tragic view of life once more exercises its gravitational attraction. Existentialists tell us that life is absurd. Positivists think it is a dance of atoms ending in cosmic exhaustion. Naturalism burdens our spirits with disenchantment. I wonder if you think the long theoretical thread I have been discussing connecting Sophocles and Plato with Boethius and Leibniz, has anything to reply to the Enlightenment's tragic view of human life. My second paper later this morning will consider some aspects of this question. Thank you.